Okay, sorry about the delay. So what I'm going to be talking tonight is basically covering off a number of things that I see that either help or hinder companies adopting DevOps. It's based on a lot of my experience, both prior to being a consultant as well as being a consultant at ThoughtWorks. A little bit of background about myself. I started out my career doing a lot of desk-side support and various things like that. I've kind of had a meandering career from there, doing development, systems administration, reluctantly Windows administration when required of me. I'm currently a senior systems engineer at Maximizer. And as I said before, I was a DevOps consultant, a senior DevOps consultant at ThoughtWorks, where I was enabling a number of companies implement continuous delivery and DevOps in the organization. Has anyone here read the continuous delivery book by Jez and Dave? So you're probably all familiar with this, this quote here. This is pretty much the elevator pitch for DevOps. But being North American, we like to bastardize what the English say and start to boil it down. And taking it down to basically these four words here. Reliable releases through automation. But there's a lot more to it than just automating everything. In order to actually be successful in achieving it in an organization, there's basically three things you need to address. One is people, the next is process, and then the final thing is the actual technology that you implement. Most people here are probably interested, what's the tools and everything else, but there's other things you need to address before you even start looking at technology. First up, I'm going to be talking about the people. People are kind of the critical component that you need to deal with. You need to talk to all the different stakeholders and different groups. First up is infatuation. And what I mean by that is emotional attachment. People have emotional attachment to things that they've spent time on, invested effort in. And that can be anything from code to processes to roles that they've established to, if they're managers, the team that they've kind of built underneath them. If you're going to do anything, you have to address that first. You have to understand what people's motivation are. You have to understand the history of how your organization got to where it is before you can actually begin to make change. I'm going to, throughout the entire talk, I'm going to try and give you positive and negative experiences that I've had in this. One of the experiences that I had when I was in Australia was working with a company, and there was a developer that from the very first day we arrived on site, he was very antagonistic towards us. Everything we had to say, he was just jumping on it the first opportunity. It became revealed to us a little bit later that he had actually been rejected from the company I was working at, and just on that premise had no interest in what we had to contribute. The way we ended up working around that was he was the primary release engineer. It took them about 5 days to get a release into an environment. After about 3 weeks, we were able to actually release and provision a new environment in about 15 minutes. That was using primarily a combination of Puppet and adapting some of the scripting that was in place. The next thing up, once you've kind of identified the history of your organization, or the history of the organization that you're in, it's then identifying what the biggest pain points are. Where are you spending the most time on a daily basis? What is it that is actually painful to do? Where are you having configuration errors and problems that are resulting in either failures in production, delayed time for QA to actually start investigating situations, things of that nature. Some examples are like difficulty of identifying if the application is functioning correctly. There's been a number of companies where you say, okay, well, what does good look like for this application? And people are like, well, it responds the way it's supposed to respond. You know, we go to this URL, but it's like, well, is it ready to serve all the traffic that it needs to? Is it warmed up the way it needs to be? Are those things available to the end, either your operations team or whoever else? Another example is having to deploy out of office hours. There's a number of organizations that have specific reserved hours, 2 a.m. or later. If you can actually bring that into daytime hours, it'll probably make your operations staff a lot happier. One of the way that I find best to deal with this and basically understand the pain points is to walk between all of the people during an actual release. Sit down with them, see the things that they're struggling with, see what they're actually doing. So if they're typing something, I remember being at one client, he basically opened about 10 different screens on screen and just rapidly typed across all of them. Inevitably, if you're doing that enough times and you're having to change, you may end up having a typo, which means that now you have an error in your environment. There's simple ways, scripting with PowerShell, using Fabric, stuff like that can all kind of work around that. The next thing regarding people is enablement. The main thing that you want to tell people is that, hey, we're looking at doing this to benefit you. We're not trying to introduce something that's going to make your life more difficult, make additional process layers that are going to slow you down. We want to make it so that you as a QA or you as a business stakeholder can say, I want to see this version in production at this point in time. And I want to see it in less than 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever your release plan is, or typical releases. One of the things that I did fairly early on in my career, probably about 10 years ago now, I was working in a small web development shop. We worked with the graphic designers and everything else. So one of the first things I did was actually introduce the idea of post-commit hooks that would deploy into a staging environment. That enabled the graphic designers to update images and a whole number of other things for websites, Flash, all those things. So that way, if you wanted to share it with clients, the clients didn't have to worry. Another example is enabling QAs. This has been a number of environments, basically being able to just specify a particular build version and say, okay, I want this to go into environment X, which they have management over. So kind of recapping, for people you need to understand the past, identify the pain points, and aim to provide autonomy. The next thing up is covering off process. Process is kind of one of those things that people, particularly in tech, aren't necessarily all that keen on, but it's just kind of for change management and things like that, it's a natural part of making sure you have a stable platform. First thing up is continuous delivery is not about shipping things junk to production faster. You want to maintain the quality of your platform at all times. It's not a race to see how quickly you can break production. That being said, continuous delivery is a little bit different than continuous deployment. And one of the fundamental things that I see as being different from continuous deployment is that you allow for manual steps should they be required. You allow people to intervene and be more selective about what's deployed where and how. There's also the reality of unless you're Facebook or a company that has massive traffic where you can say, okay, we're willing to say 5% of our clients or 5% of our user base can have a bad experience, and we can capture that in metrics and logging and everything else and kind of have that throttled back and have an auto redeploy. You're probably going to want to have some manual user and interaction QA. So there's another point where you may want to introduce a manual component. So if you're a low traffic website, but you have high value customers, you may want to introduce a manual component there. An example of where I was pushing the speed a little bit at one company was actually deploying new load balancers. We had reconfigured the load balancers. We were upgrading from CentOS 5 to CentOS 6. It was fairly large traffic. Deployed the first load balancer, and through the entire process, I had been rebooting the servers to make sure that everything came online. Made one minor change, redeployed, didn't reboot the server. That change was to IP tables, and at the time I hadn't actually added the reload of syscontrol, which meant that that load balancer was flapping. It was quickly recovered, but it was still something that is ideally not a regular occurrence. The next thing up that I'm going to be talking about is hotfixes. A lot of companies will have a separate hotfix process. One of the things that I think continuous delivery really helps with is having it so that you can efficiently say, let's follow the same process at all times. There's a couple of times where things either, particularly if it's a hotfix that's being deployed late at night, it's very easy to forget to include those things and make sure that they're captured in documentation somewhere. So as an example, if you make a small change because you notice that a configuration file wasn't actually delivered correctly and that was the fix, you need to make sure that you're capturing that. Usually, if you're in a more mature organization where you have configuration management and everything else in place, that's not going to be that much of a concern. But if you're on that path to maturity where you don't have everything in place yet, you may still have some manual processes. Another thing that I think will probably bring up some contention for people is don't repeat yourself. There's some benefits to it, but I think across a large organization, you end up having some contention around your verticals. Fundamentally, what that can mean is that you end up slowing your organization down to the pace of your slowest consumer. So rather than being able to actually enable every vertical team to deploy at their own pace, you're now putting an obstacle in them with their speed of progress. One organization that I actually ran into with this was the CSO mandated that Java 6 be deployed everywhere. One of the problems was that their primary invoicing system, and they had pretty large invoices of some odd $1 million, because they were a telecoms company, their primary invoicing system was a commercial off-the-shelf product. It required Java 5. So essentially what that meant was they had to do a custom install of Java 5 as a tarball into a folder. Problem with that is then you no longer have visibility of that, or you no longer have direct visibility of that component being a security risk without some effort. So covering off, build quality in, and aim to have quality releases happening on a regular basis. Encourage consistent behavior, and define expected output rather than forcing one common library across a large org. The final thing is getting into technology. I think there's a lot, as I've mentioned before, I think there's a lot of people that focus far too much on the tools and not think about what are the problems that we're trying to solve first and then seeing what needs to be adapted to. From what I've seen, I know that I am at times have done that myself. It's like, oh, I want to play with the tool X, and then try and shoehorn it in. Ultimately, you need to understand what the problem is first, and then start looking at what tools will address that problem best. The first thing that I'm going to bring up is consistency, or similarity between between environments, builds, a whole host of things. So as an example, if your devs aren't capable of actually reproducing the build in CI, how much value do you really take from that? Because if your CI box goes down for any reason, or if a dev needs to be able to triage something on their local machine, and for whatever reason they're working from home and don't have access to your environment, it's really good to have it so that you have consistency with your build. One common area where I've ran into in the past with this is TFS 2010. Ended up having to spend a fair amount of effort, and Jenkins probably would have solved our problem a lot faster, but it was mandated that we use TFS 2010. So we were building a pipeline there and had to spend about a week or so just trying to get the build consistent for both devs and the CI pipeline. Keeping it simple. And what I mean by this is kind of minimizing the number of variables that you have between environments and between all of your systems. And more from the operator's perspective than for anything else. If you can tell an operator that all I need to do is say, I want version X in this environment, that's a lot better than telling them all the configuration variables that they need. If you can encapsulate all of that inside of code, then it's a much better process. Ideally, you should be able to wrap your deployments in a for loop and say, and iteratively deploy to every environment, and not really have to provide a huge number of variables for that. An example from some past experience, dealing with MS Deploy, spent a lot of time investigating and looking into that, and then found later that there was a more appropriate solution, which was just deploying the actual software on a drive share, using app offline, and basically the app was up again. MS deploy at the time was very undocumented and wasn't the greatest tool to kind of work with. There's a lot of finicky issues that we ran into with it. The other thing is that building in isolation. So actually building something without a complete understanding of production, building a pipeline out and only understanding what how your local machine works as opposed to how your production environment works. So this includes things like blue-green deployments. How can I approach a deployment so the site is always available, but we're able to roll in new versions of an application. This really requires you talking to various teams and stakeholders to get a handle on what a given environment looks like. One of the things that an ex-colleague of mine always talked about was having a tracer round. And the idea being that you go between every environment and you push as far as you can. Not necessarily with your full-blown application, but the concept is that you're trying to understand the variance between every environment. What are the security concerns? What are the controls and gates that are required to enter a new environment? Who has ownership of that environment? By actually trying to go from finish to end, it gives you a better idea of your organization and what the release process looks like. Another good thing is to kind of build in health checks. This can be used in your load balancers, this can be used by your developers, and it can be used by your operations teams to instrument monitoring on a high level, something higher than just bits and bytes. So recapping on this, make it similar, keep it simple, and build what's necessary. So as you move along the path to continuous delivery and achieving a high level of maturity with it, some of the kind of benefits that you'll see to it are kind of the relief from male pattern baldness from pulling your hair out when things go wrong, faster time to market, and less risk in releases. Ideally, even deploying any time of the day without concern for what the impact is going to be on production, because you have confidence that's much higher than what you had previously. So that's it for now.